everyone, and welcome to the Windsor History Museum. My name is Katherine Mercier, and I'm the museum educator here for the Town of Windsor Museums. I'm very excited that you're here with me to go on our adventure through the museum. Let's get started. We are here in the Windsor Train Depot. This train depot was built in 1882, so it has seen centuries of Windsor history. Now today we're going to learn about some of the people and things that make up Windsor's past, and what can we use to do that? All right, when we are talking about the people and places of the past, we can learn about them using something called an artifact. Now what is an artifact? What do you think it is? Now, an artifact is anything that was made by people, and it tells us something about the people who made it. Now, you might have noticed that I'm holding gloves here in my hands, and I'm going to put these gloves on to show you guys some examples of artifacts. Now, that's because we have oils on our hands. If you've ever touched a window and you've left behind fingerprints, you know that we have oils that leave behind those fingerprints on whatever we touch. So when we handle artifacts, they're important, and we want to make sure we're wearing gloves. So my first example of an artifact that can tell us about the past is this book. Now this book was written in 1911, and it was actually written in a language called German. So this tells us that whoever was reading this book spoke the German language and may even have been from Germany. So this is an example of an artifact because it was made by people. It was originally, the paper was made out of a tree that people had to process into paper, but it also tells us something about the people who made it, which is that they were speaking German. Another example of an artifact that I have here is this interesting little box. Now this box doesn't look like much, right? But it tells us a lot about the people who were using it. This is actually a box that held processed American cheese. So if you've ever eaten Kraft cheese at home, this is one of the original cheese boxes that your cheese would have come in many years ago. So again, this is an artifact because it tells us something about the people who were using it. It tells us what they were eating, which is a really important fact to know about people in the past. Now my last artifact is a little bit tricky. What is this? Do you guys all recognize this? This is a pencil, right? You guys all probably use this at home or in your own classroom. And you might not think that this is an artifact because a lot of times we think that artifacts are really old, they're in museums, they're really special, but artifacts can be everyday objects too. What do you guys think that this pencil could tell you about me? Well, the first thing it could tell you is that I can write. It also tells you I'm left-handed because I'm holding it with my left hand. And it also tells you that we are a society who knows writing, we like to write, and that we've figured out how to use a material called lead. We put it inside a wooden pencil, and we use that to write. So it tells you a lot about who we are as people. So today we're going to see many of these artifacts that are going to tell us about the people and the places of Windsor's past. Did you know that people have been living in the Windsor area for thousands of years? That's right. We know that people have been here for a very long time. Now, does anyone recognize the animals in this photo next to me? They are bison or buffalo. Some of you might have seen them before. And if we were going to go back in time, 3,000 to 8,000 years ago here in Windsor, if you looked out your window and you looked across the fields, this is what you would see. Fields and fields of bison. And these bison brought a lot of Native Americans who were living here in the area to hunt the bison. The Native Americans, such as the Arapaho and the Cheyenne peoples who lived here in the area, were using the bison for everything. For meat, they would use bison hides for their teepees that they would live in. So they really relied on these bison. And we know that they were here because Windsor has a very famous historical site called the Kaplan Hoover Bison Bone Bed. And there's the remains of dozens of bison that we know that Native Americans were eating and using for food here in the area. Now, I am standing here next to this giant photo that was taken in downtown Windsor in the early 1900s. Now, you might recognize some of the buildings in this photo. We are facing west towards the mountains, so you can see the mountains over there. And then there's a building on the right that is Chimney Park Restaurant today. But how in the world did Windsor get from fields and fields of bison to a town like what we see here in this photo? Well, Windsor had something called resources. Resources are things that exist in the world, like water and trees, that we can use and turn into an industry, like woodworking, building houses, or using water for crops. And Windsor had a lot of these natural resources that brought people here to the area for things like farming and ranching. So when this photo was taken, many people who lived here in Windsor had farms or had lots of cows. They grew things and crops like potatoes, and they would come into town for shopping. So at this point, you can see that a lot of people have moved here to the Windsor area. Now, downtown might look a little bit different today than in this photo. You'll notice that the street is actually dirt. Can you imagine how muddy it would get after it rained, having to walk downtown to go get ice cream after in all of the dirt? And some of the buildings that still exist today are these buildings here, all still exist today. You'll notice that there was a dentist. Kids back in the early 1900s had to go to the dentist, just like you guys. And over here too, you can actually see two kids in the photo, and they're playing a game where they jump over a log. So there's a log right here, and they're jumping over it. So you guys can see a little bit into how people were living here in Windsor over 100 years ago. All right, so a little bit ago I mentioned the word industry. Let's talk a little bit about the industries that really brought people here to Windsor and made it grow. Now, one of the main ones has to do with the thing I'm holding in my hands here. This is a model of something called a sugar beet. Now, important question for you guys. Do any of you like to eat sugar? I don't know. I bet you all do. So did you guys know that a lot of the sugar that we have here in northern Colorado actually comes from this, called a sugar beet? And you can see a whole field of them on this picture behind me. And we can actually take these sugar beets, and in factories we can process them down into sugar. Now, our Windsor area is the perfect place for sugar beets to grow. We have a lot of really nice dirt here, and it's the perfect place for sugar beets. And people started realizing this in about 1900, so around 120 years ago. And in 1903, we actually had our own factory here in Windsor that was constructed just to process all of these sugar beets into sugar. One of these sugar beets looks pretty big, right? And they can actually get a little bit larger than this. Now, sugar beets are very difficult to farm. They take a lot of work. You have to do a lot of weeding so that they can thrive and grow nice and tall so that you can process them into sugar. But one of these sugar beets only makes about 3 teaspoons of sugar. Have you ever seen a teaspoon at home in your kitchen? It's pretty small, right? So one of these beets, only 3 teaspoons of sugar. Don't you think that you would need thousands and thousands, maybe even millions and millions of sugar beets just to make all of the sugar that we were making in the Windsor Sugar Factory here every year? So since we needed to plant and harvest millions of sugar beets every year, do you think that took a lot of people? It did, but when the sugar industry arrived here in Windsor in the early 1900s, we only had less than 1,000 people living here. So we needed more people to farm the sugar beets. Where in the world did more people come from? Well, they came all the way from a place called Russia. And these were people called Germans from Russia. They were people who used to live in Germany, and then they moved to Russia looking for a better life there. Now that didn't work out quite how they thought. Some bad things happened in Russia, and they were looking for a new place to live right as Windsor was looking for people to farm the sugar beets. So in this case next to me, I have some artifacts. Remember the word artifacts? And these are clues that tell us more about the Germans from Russia who moved here to Windsor and helped farm the sugar beets. Now here in the front of the case, we have what's called a beet knife. Now you might notice it looks kind of like a giant knife, but it has a really big hook on the end. Why would you want a hook on the end of your knife? Well, it's because when you are farming sugar beets, you have to get them out of the ground, and sometimes they're pretty hard to get out of the ground. And so you would take this beet knife and you would chop the hook right into the top of the beet, and you would use that to pull the beet out of the ground. Then you had to get the top off of the beet because the top would make your sugar taste really, really bad, so you'd have to use the blade of the knife to chop it off. So this gives us a clue into how they were farming sugar beets. We also have this really big pair of thick woolen boots. Why do you think you would want to wear such a pair of thick boots? Probably because it got pretty cold in the fields, right? You were out there in the fall, in the mud, in the dirt, and you would have wanted a really nice pair of boots to keep your feet nice and warm and dry. So you can see how we can use artifacts as a way to see how people were living in the past. Now take a quick look at this photo for me. Who do you see in this photo? What's going on in this photo? Well, when we look closely, we can actually see that this is an entire family who is working on farming sugar beets. You'll notice that they're actually holding sugar beets. This woman's even holding a beet knife, just like the one we just talked about, in her hand, because she just pulled this beet out of the ground. But you might notice that there's kids in this photo too who are farming. There's a little girl standing here, and then there's a little boy who's operating the plow on the back of this horse. So the entire family was involved in sugar beet farming. When you got home from school at the end of the day, you had to go right out to the field and help your family with the farming. So you didn't get to just sit on your couch and play video games. You had to go out and keep working so that your family could have money to survive. So the whole family would all work together. Can you imagine doing that with your parents and siblings? So once all of these people, called Germans from Russia, moved here to Windsor, where did they live? Remember, Windsor wasn't a very large town at the time, and so people living in Windsor had to really quickly come up with something for all the new people moving here to live in. And their solution was where we are now, which is called a Beet Shack. Now it's called a shack because it's fairly small. This one's only 2 rooms, so they usually only had a couple of rooms. And you can't tell because you're watching a video, but it's really, really hot in here. So there was no heating, there was no air conditioning. The walls were just made out of a really simple paper. So the hot and the cold came in and out really easily. Now we're standing in what was sort of the living room. So there's a dining area, a kitchen with a little kerosene stove, and right now I'm standing in the laundry room. So this is actually called a washboard, and this is what they would use to wash their laundry. You would rub your clothes right on here to get them nice and clean, and use this bucket of water to clean it. Now where's the sink? Oh wait. There isn't a sink in here. You would have to go out to the pump and pump your water to bring it in here. So it was definitely a lot more work to do laundry here in the Beet Shack. Now looking around at the size of the Beet Shack, how many families do you think were living in here? Well, you might think, well, just one family, right? Because it's not very large. But oftentimes, because there were so many people needed out on the farms to farm sugar beets, multiple families would be living in one Beet Shack. So we have this Beet Shack set up like 2 families are living in here. Let's go to the bedroom and check it out. All right, so we are here in the bedroom, and the first thing you might notice is that there's actually 2 beds in here. One bed next to me and one bed over there. Now you might think, oh, maybe one bed is for the adults and one bed is for the kids. Well, we actually know that oftentimes multiple families who were living in one Beet Shack would have one entire family on one bed. And you would actually have to sleep like this, lengthwise, instead of how you sleep in your bed at home, which is stretched out across the whole way, just so that your whole family could fit on the bed with you. And not only are you sleeping on one bed with your entire family, there's another family sleeping on that bed over there. Does that sound very pleasant? It probably wasn't, right? But we also know that many of the Germans from Russia who lived in these beet shacks would often only live in them while they were farming the beets out on the farms, and sometimes they would have a different house in town. Or once they did enough farming and they got enough money, they would immediately buy or build a nicer farmhouse than this one. Now, one last question for you guys. During our time in the Beet Shack, did anybody see a bathroom? Well, it turns out, again, I'm standing right next to it. If you guys look underneath this bed, you will actually see a little pot underneath there. That's called a chamber pot. Now, a beet shack like this would have an outhouse where you could go outside. But if it was really cold in the middle of the night or it was dark and you didn't want to go outside, you would just go in the pot underneath your bed. Now, whose job was it in the morning to clean out the chamber pot? It wasn't your parents'. It was your job. It was the kids' job to clean out the chamber pot. So again, do you think it would be very much fun to go back in time and live in one of these beet shacks? Probably not. Let's go see a farmhouse, a great example of where you would have probably much more wanted to live 100 years ago. We are inside our farmhouse, which we think dates to about the 1910s, 1920s, so around 100 years old. Now, if you look around the farmhouse, we're inside the kitchen and dining room right now. Do you think it looks a little bit different than the beet shack we were just in? What can you find that looks a little bit different? Well, the first thing I notice is that it's a lot bigger, right? We have more space here in the farmhouse. We have a nice table right in the center where we can sit down and eat. We have space for our dishes, and we even have an electric stove. You'll notice that we have knobs on here, just like the knobs that you might have on your stove at home. So we have electricity in this house, which would be a huge deal. Now you could have lights that you turned on instead of having to use candles or go to bed when it got dark. So it was a really big deal for this farmhouse to have electricity. Now you might notice that we also have more workspaces here inside of our farmhouse, and we have some artifacts that tell us what people of the past were doing inside of our farmhouse. So does anyone recognize this artifact? You might have one of these or something like this that looks similar at your house. It's an old mixer or egg beater. So we know that they were baking inside of this house. We also know that because of our rolling pin that we have as an artifact in here. So this definitely tells us that people were rolling out things like dough. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that we have electricity in this house. So there's a very exciting artifact that would have been fantastic for your breakfast once you've had electricity in your house. And it is a toaster. Now, can anyone spot a toaster? It looks a little bit different than our toaster that we have today. The toaster is hiding right up here on this shelf. You'll notice that there's no protection at all on the outside. It's just the hot metal. So you had to be really, really careful when you got your toast out of this toaster. Can anyone guess what room we're standing in now? This was actually the living room of the farmhouse. So the family had their own living room that they got to sit in. And you'll notice a couple of artifacts in here that tell us what the family that lived in this house was doing. Now, first off, you'll notice a sewing machine here. Now, how many of you are wearing clothes that you sewed yourself? Probably not very many of you if I was gonna guess, but if you lived 120 years ago here in Windsor, you would probably know how to sew, and you would probably know how to make a lot of your own clothes, or at least clothes for your dolls or toys. So we have a sewing machine in here to show how the family was sewing. We also have a desk in this space. So they had a space where they could sit and read, they could write their letters, that sort of thing, maybe like what you do at home today. And then we also have something in here that we know they were using to have fun with. Now, you might not recognize it right away, but this is actually a radio. Do any of you ever ride in the car with your parents and listen to the radio? Well, you could have done that 100 years ago in your own home. You could listen to radio shows. They had shows of exciting adventures, just like we have TV shows now. So every night the kids in the house would come and sit next to this radio and listen to the exciting shows that you could hear on it. So that's a little bit about what kids were doing for fun. We talked about how you guys would have been farming, you could have been living in this house, listening to the radio, or living in the Beet Shack, cleaning out the chamber pot. Do you guys think you would have been going to school? Let's go check that out. We are here inside of our one-room schoolhouse. This was called the Whitehall Schoolhouse, and it was built here in Windsor in 1885. Now I want you to take a look around this one-room schoolhouse for me. Can you notice anything that is different from your classroom today? What about things that are the same? Can you find anything that's the same? Let's just take a minute to look around and see what we can find. So a couple of things that I noticed that are the same, things that you might have in your classroom today, are the American flag. Do you have an American flag in your classroom? We also have pictures of presidents on the back wall, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Maybe you have pictures of presidents on your wall as well. Now we also have a teacher's desk. Does your teacher have a desk that she sits at in your classroom? Probably. So just like your teacher does today, teachers in the past had desks of their own that they could sit at as well. Now we also have desks here in our one-room schoolhouse, but you might have noticed a couple of differences about our desks. So you might notice that this front desk is really, really small. But if you look at the back desk, it's about twice as large. So here in our one-room schoolhouse, you would have multiple grades of children all attending the same school. So if you were a second grader, you would be going to school with kids in first grade and kids in fifth grade, or maybe even older than that. And while the teacher was busy teaching one of the grades, she would have assigned the second graders to help teach the first graders. So you were going to school, but you were also helping other kids to learn too. So that's something that's a little bit different. You might have desks in your classroom, but they're probably all a similar size because right now, second graders aren't in the same classroom with fifth graders. Now, a couple of other things that are different, you might not have a stove in your classroom, but when this schoolhouse was built, it did not have electricity. So this is another important artifact that tells us how people of the past were living. We know that they had to bring in coal or wood to burn inside this stove. In fact, that would have been one of your jobs when you got to school in the morning, was to go outside and get wood from the wood pile for the teacher. And someone else would have been in charge of sweeping the floor. So you would have had to do a couple of chores even when you were at school. So that's something that's a little bit different too. Something else that's a little bit different is this little bowl right here. Now when you get to school, you might have a sink in your classroom, but just like when we were in the Beet Shack, you might notice that there's no restroom inside of this school. So they probably had an outhouse outside that they would have gone in, and then you would have had a pitcher of water that you would pour the water in, and you would all have washed your hands right here at our little sink here in the front of the classroom. Now when you go to school and you attend school in your classroom, you might bring a lunch with you, or maybe you eat lunch in the cafeteria. Well, there's no cafeteria here, and so you would have had to bring your own lunch with you, and the lunch bag that they would have used looks a little bit different than what we used today. So here we have what's called a lunch pail, and sometimes you would have had to travel a very long way from your house to school, and so you would have kept your lunch nice and cool in this lunch pail, and then you would have hung it up right here by the door when you got to school. And maybe you have hooks just like this, or cubbies that are similar to this in your classroom. So it's kind of interesting to see how things have changed, right? Our lunch pails don't look like this anymore, but maybe just like these hooks here, you have a cubby or a space in your own classroom to put your lunch or to put your backpack when you get to school. So do you think you could have gone back in time to 100 or 150 years ago and lived here in Windsor? There would have been some fun parts like learning how to sew or being outside a lot. But there also would have been some not so fun parts like cleaning out the chamber pot or having to teach other kids in school. So maybe you would have, maybe you wouldn't have, but regardless, it's so cool that we've all gone back into the past today and we've looked at artifacts that have shown us how people lived way back 100 or more years ago in time. So thank you for coming on our adventure through Windsor's history today. If you have more questions or you want to find out anything about the museum or our programs and events that we do here, visit recreationliveshere.com/culture.